there's still some debate about keep the balance between the two powers.
Trying to have a good economic relationship with China and a good security relationship with the United States makes perfect sense.
You know this is not the time for that.
Well,
안녕하세요 여러분, 김지윤입니다. 네, 제가 컨퍼런스 때문에 지금 미국 워싱턴 DC에 와 있는데요. 또 대단히 유명하시고 아주 석학이신 분을 만나서 인터뷰를 해보려고 합니다. 하버드대학교의 현실주의 국제정치학의 거두다라고 우리가 말할 수 있는 스티븐 월트 교수님입니다. 마침 또 컨퍼런스에 오셔서요. 함께 이야기를 조금 나눠보겠습니다. Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I'm very pleased to be with you.
my pleasure.
I can listen to you for hours, but we don't have that much time, so let's just get to the point. So my first question is, for decades, the world has been quite stable and relatively peaceful, I would say, and some people attribute that to the post-World War II international order. Maybe you do not agree with that, but anyway, that international order is actually unraveling in recent days. First of all, I'd like to listen to your assessment about the global affairs and international order or the current issues. And also, secondly, some say, well, it has been bipolar system between the US and USSR. And after Cold War ends, it's unipolar. And now we are becoming into the multipolar system. But on the second thought, it can also be the bipolar system again, but this time only is between the United States and China. I'd like to hear your take on this.
Okay. You shouldn't exaggerate how stable the world was before. Even in places like Asia, we did have the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War as well. There have been many conflicts in the Middle East. There have been conflicts in Africa that have killed millions of people in this period. There have been some areas of stability as well. There has not been a great power war since 1945, and I think you can attribute some of that to the institutions and structures that existed, and also to the fact that it was a bipolar competition, the United States versus the Soviet Union, and that made it actually somewhat predictable. It was competitive, but it was also rather predictable on both sides. What we're seeing today is that system breaking down and being replaced. Certainly one thing to worry about is that it is now, I think, a multipolar system with at least three great powers. The United States still the strongest, China number two, and Russia a distant third, but still a major power in certain respects. Some might add also India, possibly some other countries, Brazil as very weak but still substantial powers as well. And one problem with that is it does become less predictable. There are more potential conflicts that could break out, and it's less certain how each of the different parties might respond. Now, I would add then a whole series of other developments that worry me, not because they're necessarily bad in and of themselves, but because they make conflicts or disagreements more likely. One is we're seeing big demographic changes, populations getting older, shrinking in various ways. We're seeing a breakdown in the international norms. Principles that people largely accepted didn't violate very often, sometimes, but not very often. I think that's happening. I think climate change has had conflict-producing effects in a number of places and is going to continue to do that as well. So you add that to the existence of a multipolar structure and one where it's no longer quite clear exactly what Russia is going to do, what the United States is going to do, and also what China is likely to do. And you have a world that's more dangerous than the one we've been in.
Well, I read one of your articles in Foreign Policy. You said that Europe still needs the United States to remain in the continent because they cannot ensure their security on, and also they increasingly fear Russia's aggressiveness. But clearly the United States is more focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And this government, the Trump administration, seems to be very much interested in pulling their power from Europe and focusing in the Indo-Pacific. My first question is, the Europe then can be less secure, less safe, and more dangerous And after seeing how the United States pull their power from Europe, and how can the Indo-Pacific regions, the allies like Korea and Japan, ensure that the U.S. will still there when we are in the danger or crisis?
I actually don't think Europe is incapable of defending itself. Europe has much more population than Russia does. Europe's combined economies are much larger than Russia's. And in fact, European countries until very recently were spending more on the military. If you put them all together.
The Russophobia is more exaggerated.
Well, I'm just saying that they have the potential to defend themselves. They have not turned that potential into genuine military power, but they could do so if they wish. Now, if the United States leaves tomorrow, Europe would be in trouble. I don't think they're as vulnerable as you might think, because look at all the problems that Russia has had just trying to fight in Ukraine. They have not been sweeping across Ukraine rapidly. They could not sweep across Europe. If Europe has time to develop its own capabilities, then it's capable of doing it itself. My worry is, of course, that the United States under Donald Trump will not just pull the plug on Europe very quickly before they have time to build up, but in many respects, the Trump administration seems almost hostile to Europe, treats it as an adversary rather than as an ally. And I think that's something the Europeans have to worry about very much. Situation in Asia is somewhat different because the United States, including President Trump, does see China as a serious peer competitor, but it can't contain China, or it can't respond to China in Asia without partners in Asia. The United States is not an Asian country, so it needs Japan, it needs South Korea, it needs Australia, it needs a good relationship with India, and it should have been trying to build closer relations with a number of other countries in Asia who are also interested in making sure that Asia doesn't dominate it. In other words, American interests are directing us to focus on China. And that's one reason why Asian countries, I think, don't have to be as worried, except that the United States, again, under President Trump, also tends to pick fights with our allies, usually on trade questions and other things like that. Makes it more difficult for American allies to maintain popular support for close ties with the United States, but also to do things that the United States wants and to not think that the United States is going to punish them if it's disappointing. And that worries me as well, because, of course, the Chinese are going to try to present themselves as a more reliable partner, as a more predictable than the United States. And some people in some of these Asian countries may start to believe that.
Well, in Korea, China is not particularly very popular country for now. But what I'm concerning is for the next 4 years, maybe people say, oh, the U.S. is not, they say they are ally, but they are not really behaving like an ally. So maybe we cannot really trust the U.S. So that's the situation some people are worried about.
I think they are right to worry. And Americans should worry about creating that set of ideas or attitudes in the populations of our allies.
It's a really quick question. Why does Donald Trump is so hostile toward Europe? Is there any reason for that?
Well, first of all, he's obsessed with things like trade balances and thinks incorrectly that the Europeans have been sort of stealing American jobs, taking advantage of us. Second, he correctly is upset that Europe has not been contributing as much to the common defense. That's not unique to Donald Trump, by the way. Every American president has worried about that. But also, he sees the European Union as something of a competitor, an economic rival. What he would like to do is divide Europe up so he can deal individually with France, with Germany, with the United Kingdom, with Italy, because, of course, the United States is much larger than all of those. One other thing is that I think Trump and many of the people around him are not very comfortable with liberal democracy. Trump has autocratic tendencies, and part of what you see now is his support that people like Elon Musk are giving to the far right in Europe. So Trump really likes Viktor Orban in Hungary. Musk has been talking about how he likes the Alternative for Germany, the far right neo-Nazi party in Germany. When Vice President Vance went to the Munich Security Conference, he didn't meet with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He met with the head of the AfD. So it's not just, they're also hostile in some ways on ideological grounds. They would like to see Europe move in the MAGA direction, embracing a set of traditional values, moving away from liberal values, and in some respects, even maybe moving away from democracy. I think that's actually very worrisome.
Well, the U.S. is definitely focusing more on the Indo-Pacific area in response to growing influence of China. So if China becomes a dominant power in the region, then what are the consequences, not just to the United States, of course, to Japan and Korea and neighboring countries?
Well, I don't think China wants to physically conquer countries in Asia. I don't think it's capable of doing that, and I don't think it wants to do that. What China would like to do is, first of all, get the United States out of Asia, remove the American military forces there, make the United States an unimportant economic player in Asia. And then what it would like from its Asian neighbors is deference. It doesn't want them doing things that it doesn't like. It wants them to always be asking themselves, is China going to be angry if I do this or that or whatever? It wants a relationship where these countries are deferential, submissive to China without being formally controlled, sort of an informal empire. And that means if they're able to achieve that, that countries in Asia will not be fully independent or fully sovereign. They'll always be having to ask themselves, is this okay with China? And China might also be able to then establish more exploitive economic ties as well. So it's not good for countries in Asia, and they all know that. It's also not good for the United States, of course, because in that world, China wouldn't have to worry about security in Asia. It would be very safe at that point, wouldn't have any enemies anywhere, and it would therefore be able to start influencing events in other parts of the world, projecting power into different places without having to worry very much about protecting itself at home, including into the Western Hemisphere. Notice this is exactly what the United States has done in reverse. We're very safe. We don't worry about Canada or Mexico attacking us. We don't worry about Venezuela attacking us, which allows the United States to be involved in Asia, to be involved in the Middle East, involved in other places. So the United States also has an interest in making sure that China is not the dominant power in Asia. I think, again, it would be very difficult for China to establish that role, and the United States, along with its Asian partners, can prevent that from happening. But that's, I think, why Chinese domination would be a problem both for its neighbors, but also for the United States.
There's still some debate about Korea's foreign policy and keep the balance between the two powers, like the United States and China. Maybe this is the time that we have to make a decision between these two countries. We are, as you know, heavily relying on the national security on the United States and also have very extensive trade and economic relations with China. So what would be the recommendation from you to our foreign policymakers?
First of all, trying to have a good economic relationship with China and a good security relationship with the United States makes perfect sense. And if South Korea can do that, that's the best outcome for South Korea.
You know this is not the time for that.
Well, so I wouldn't, if I were South Korea, I would not be doing things deliberately to upset the economic relationship with China. And it's worth remembering that the Chinese economy is having its own problems right now. So there's limits to how much pressure they would want to put on South Korea. But if one has to choose, security is more important than trade, ultimately. Because if you don't have security, then it doesn't matter how rich you are, someone can take it away in a variety of ways. So the first goal for all states is to try and preserve their security, preserve their independence, their sovereignty, their autonomy as well. So if South Korea has to choose, they have to, I think, choose security over economics. I don't think it's going to be that stark, a sort of all one, all the other. By the way, there's a lesson in that for the United States as well. The weakest part of American policy towards Asia is that we don't have a coherent economic strategy. Ever since we left the Trans-Pacific Partnership back in 2017, we really haven't had a good economic approach to our allies in Asia. And that would be the one missing piece that I would like to think a future American administration would do something about. But I'm not optimistic that the Trump administration will.
Well, I'd like to touch upon the Middle East, though. The reliance on the Middle Eastern oil by the United States has dramatically declined. So what does that mean about the United States Middle East foreign policy? So it seems like they would like to now pull their influence and everything out of the Middle East.
Well, it's important to understand that the United States does not get much of its oil now from the Middle East, but we are still to some degree dependent on oil being pumped in the Middle East and going out to world markets. So if you cut off all the oil from Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq and everybody else in the Middle East, the price, the supply in the world would go way up, and that would cost more for Americans and for everybody else. So we still have an interest in making sure that enough energy is available for other countries as well. So the fact that we don't get it from the Middle East doesn't eliminate our interest at all. The United States, of course, has been very actively involved in the Middle East and not very successfully for a long time. And I believe that's because we have tended to have special relations with some countries, with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel in particular, and no relationship really at all with countries like Iran. So we have no real influence over Iran, and that's very different than what most other countries do. Europe deals with everybody. Russia deals with everybody. China deals with everybody. Other countries in Asia deal with everybody in the region. And that's what the United States should be doing in the Middle East. We should have normal business-like relations with every country and support the ones that support what we want and oppose countries who are opposed to our interests in various ways. And right now, our allies tend to take us for granted and don't listen to us, and our adversaries aren't able to negotiate better arrangements with us. I don't think in the long run that's healthy for the United States, and it certainly has not been good for the region.
So normalize the relationship with Iran?
Yes, I would normalize relations with Iran. Doesn't mean you're friends, but we have relations with China. Why can't we have relations with Iran?
I see. Well, this is going to be my last question. Although Korea is a very important ally to the United States, as long as the U.S. is interested in this region, the Indo-Pacific area, but somehow the Trump administration is treating us like transactional business partners. What do you think that we should expect from the U.S. and also should be prepared for?
Well, again, as I said, the United States has an overriding strategic interest in maintaining good partnerships with Asian countries. I think that was one of the major successes of the Biden administration, was solidifying some of those relationships. The problem is you're dealing now with an American administration and an American president who's very erratic and who seems to be more comfortable often with autocrats, with dictators, who he thinks he can deal with one-on-one, than he is comfortable with countries that are democratically elected, that have their own politics, that sometimes have their own interests, and where the relationship is more complicated and more difficult. I think that the obvious thing is that South Korea and other allies should do is, first of all, they should continue to cooperate with each other, because, of course, what Trump would like to do is deal with South Korea separately and then deal with everyone bilaterally, because then he's in a much more powerful position. If Australia, Japan, South Korea can all speak in a united way back to the United States, they're more likely to be heard and less likely for the United States to sort of play divide and rule, even with our allies.
Thank you so much, Professor Walter. It was really insightful conversation.
Pleasure talking with you.